she could have anyone. That is the assumption most people carry about the most beautiful women in Hollywood, and on the surface, it looks true. Every room she walks into rearranges itself around her. Every man who wants a chance gets one, if he is lucky enough to catch her eye at all. And yet, watch what actually happens. Over and over, across decade after decade of public relationships, across different faces, different eras, different studios entirely, the pattern repeats itself like clockwork. The good ones, the stable ones, the men who show up on time, remember details, and never once play a game, are the ones she eventually pushes away. Meanwhile, someone unreliable, someone who barely bothers to try, somehow keeps her circling back for years, sometimes for the rest of her public life. This is not bad luck. This is not a coincidence repeating itself across hundreds of women in an industry built entirely around image. Not once, not twice, across an entire industry, an entire century of it, in interview after interview that all somehow end the same way. There is a reason hiding underneath this, and it has almost nothing to do with the men. To understand it, you have to slow down and look at what happens to someone whose value gets defined by appearance before she is even old enough to understand what value means. Psychologists who study early attention and self-worth have long noted something specific. When a child, and later a teenager, receives consistent, outsized attention for how they look rather than for anything they say, do, or create, it wires how they read other people's interests for the rest of their life. Attention starts to feel like a transaction rather than a connection. Every compliment, every gesture, every person who wants to get close carries an unspoken question underneath it. What exactly are they actually here for? This suspicion never stays confined to romance. It bleeds into friendships, into professional relationships, into casual encounters with strangers who recognize her face before they know anything else about her, until almost every form of attention she receives arrives pre-filtered through the same quiet, exhausting question. This is not vanity. This is not paranoia. This is a survival skill built early, because in a world where your image is constantly being evaluated, wanted, and sometimes exploited, learn to scan for the real motive behind someone's interest becomes the only way to feel even slightly safe. Nobody teaches this skill directly. Nobody sits a young girl down and explains the rule. It builds itself quietly, one interaction at a time, until it stops feeling like a skill at all, and starts feeling like simply who she is, so completely fused with her personality that pulling it apart later feels almost impossible, even for her. Now watch how fast this compounds. By the time a woman becomes one of the most visible, desired faces in the world, the scanning has become completely automatic, running quietly underneath every interaction she has, whether she notices it or not. She has spent years being approached by people who wanted proximity to her fame, her body, her image, or the status of being seen with her, long before she ever gets a chance to find out whether any of them see her as a person underneath all of it. So a habit forms without her ever choosing it directly. Every new person gets tested for the catch, because there has almost always been one. Assistants, managers, agents, even friends, over the years, have wanted something from her that had little to do with her as a person. And then a genuinely good man arrives, the rare one who wants nothing but her, without an angle, without a hidden motive, without anything to gain beyond her actual company. And he becomes the hardest puzzle she has ever encountered. There is no catch to find. That absence, strangely, is disorienting rather than comforting, because a nervous system trained since adolescence to expect a hidden motive does not know what to do with a person who genuinely has none. It does not relax. It searches harder. So watch what happens next, because this is where it moves fast. Safety itself starts to feel suspicious, because in her experience, safety has rarely arrived without strings attached later, and every time it seemed to, the strings surface eventually anyway, a little further down the road. So she tests him, not consciously, not out of cruelty. She cancels plans without explanation. She goes quiet right after a moment that felt closer than usual. She grows suddenly critical of small, harmless things, all of it functioning less like real dissatisfaction and more like a stress test run on his patience, checking whether his interest survives being unmet, unrewarded, unreciprocated for a while. Because if his interest disappears the moment it stops being rewarded, that confirms something familiar, that he wanted the image after all, and the fear gets to feel justified instead of paranoid, which is in its own strange way, easier to carry than uncertainty. And if he stays anyway, unmoved, unbothered, still showing up the next morning as if nothing happened at all, the test does not end there. It simply resets, quietly, waiting to run again. And then the part almost nobody names directly. He does not perform. He does not chase. He does not escalate the moment she pulls back, which means she cannot predict him the way she has learned to predict everyone else. And unpredictability, even good unpredictability, reads to a nervous system built around control as its own category of threat. An unstable partner gives her something familiar to manage. A stable one gives her nothing to do at all except sit still and trust. And trust, for someone wired this way, might be the single hardest instruction her nervous system has ever been asked to follow. Not because she does not want to trust him, because trusting him means giving up the one tool that has kept her safe her entire adult life. And here it is, the part that changes everything, the part hiding underneath every headline about another beautiful woman who somehow keeps choosing the wrong man. She is not pushing away good men because she does not want good. She is pushing away the specific vulnerability of being loved for something other than the image, because that particular kind of love cannot be controlled, cannot be predicted, and cannot be taken back on her own terms the way image-based attention always could. An unreliable man who chases sporadically and disappears on command is, paradoxically, easier to manage than a stable one who simply stays, because his very stability removes the one tool she has relied on her entire life to feel safe, the ability to control exactly how close someone gets and exactly when. A good man does not play that game. And not playing the game is precisely what makes him feel, to a nervous system wired the specific way, like the most dangerous option in the room, not the safest one, which is the exact opposite of how it looks to everyone watching from the outside, and precisely why this pattern keeps getting misread again and again as pickiness, as fear of commitment, or simply as bad taste in men, when it is the exact opposite of all three. She does not choose chaos because she prefers it. She chooses chaos because chaos, unlike stability, has never once asked her to put down her guard completely. Take a breath, because none of this makes her broken. And it does not mean beauty is some kind of curse either, a narrative repeated far too often that explains almost nothing useful about what is actually happening underneath it. What actually happened is far more ordinary than the tabloid version of this story ever suggests, and far more common than the framing around any single famous woman ever lets on. Anyone whose earliest experience of being valued was tied to something external, looks, money, status, talent applauded before the person underneath it is truly known, tends to develop this exact same suspicion toward love that arrives without a visible hook attached to it. Beauty simply happens to be the most visible, most publicly documented version of this pattern, played out under lights and cameras instead of quietly, privately, the way it happens for almost everyone else who learned the same lesson without an audience watching, in ordinary towns, in ordinary families, with no headlines attached to any of it at all, and no columnist ever writing a single word about why it happened. So the good man is never really the problem here, and neither is she, not in the way this story usually gets told. The problem is a pattern built long before either of them ever met, one that treats real, uncomplicated love as the single hardest thing to trust, precisely because it comes with nothing to catch, nothing to scan for, nothing familiar to hold on to in place of certainty. Some women eventually learn to sit with that discomfort long enough to let a good man stay, slowly, without any dramatic turning point to mark the moment it happened. Most do not because they lack the capacity for it, but because unlearning a survival skill built since childhood takes far longer than falling for the wrong person ever does, and far longer than any single relationship is usually given to prove itself. And maybe that, more than any headline about beauty and heartbreak, is the actual story worth telling here. The hardest person to let love you well is rarely the one chasing hardest. It is the one who finally stops chasing altogether, and simply stays, asking for nothing in return except the one thing she was never quite taught how to give, the benefit of the doubt.